Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that, oh, hang on a minute. Let me make sure that this is actually, um, that the voice is, yep, we're good. Okay. So I just wanted to make sure that that was recording digitally. Um, do, 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 do. Hi, my name is Kelly Margaret Hakola, and this is my final presentation on 21st Century Disability Community Services. So this is the project scenario that I established. Um, the project scenario is that you were just hired to be a community relations or spokesperson for a small nonprofit organization. The small nonprofit serves a local developmentally disabled community, but new local legislation is seeing their residential and daycare services phased out and separated from their independent living counseling. So the differences between those two services, residential and daycare services being more long-term services for the disabled and handicapped that are more like adult daycare centers and long-term living centers, like group homes and institutions, which are the more traditional form of care. And independent living counseling is the trend that has been going on for the past 30 to 45 years or so, where we've seen this growing trend toward deinstitutionalization and living in the community with community supports. And that is the current legal and trend that we see in the country today and globally. And of course, the latter holds a larger client base within the community because of these trends. The board of the nonprofit has an ambitious plan to renovate their former residential and adult day center facility, and they want to use their current building, which is already an asset that they have, to create an adult independent living community center for the disabled. Since they already have this building, they might as well use it since it is an asset that they have. They did already have independent living counselors there, and in this scenario that I created, they're happy. In my mind, they might have had offices that were crammed into a hallway, just like a single hallway, and perhaps maybe neglected before. And when the board reached out to the independent living counselors, they mentioned that maybe that some input from the local disabled community might be helpful, since the board is mostly able-bodied, which is pretty common in these types of situations, and that for the plan to be successful, that type of reach out to the local community was necessary. Consequently, the board then hired a recently college graduated young disabled woman as their community relations spokesperson to conduct research and see what the needs and wants were in an independent living community center for the 21st century to better serve the local community. So that's the project scenario. I hope that's not too long-winded of an explanation. So some context. This is the context behind the situation, and especially for the legislation. So rights for disabled Americans are very recent. If you compare them with rights for other types of minorities. So rights for disabled Americans began in the civil rights movement of the 1970s. The first kind of major piece of legislation was the passage of the 504 Rehabilitation Act in 1973. This act ensured anything that was funded by the federal government, whether that was like a public school or a public university, anything that had federal money attached to it had to be made accessible to persons with disabilities. Um, so that was signed in 1973. However, the private sectors like private businesses, private schools and colleges, anything that was within the private realm would remain inaccessible until 1990 with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. Other legislation, and that also included state and local governments as well. Other legislation like IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, was a four-part piece of legislation that was enacted between 1975 to 1990. And deinstitutionalization, which has been a part, which was a huge part of that process, has therefore been slow to enact, and the legislation has only really been about 30 to 47 years old. And that's why you see this change and shift happening between these daycare and residential programs being kind of shifted into community integration and more of into a independent living center type setting, and why that's the focus now, because the legislation is geared towards that way, and that's the trend. It's far less expensive for to have institutions, and that's sort of the way the legislation is going, and due in part and parcel to disability activists. Vocational rehabilitation is a process of preparing persons with physical, sensory, emotional, developmental, or other disabilities for employment. What vocational rehabilitation does, it places persons with disabilities in jobs and careers and assists them to cope effectively within their environment and to help them function as independently as possible. These types of programs are associated with programs that could be funded by the federal government or state government and local government. Increasingly, however, vocational rehabilitation programs are involved within the private sector and are funded by nonprofits, as well as local businesses and local business and industry. So you see that increasingly it's less funded by state and local governments and more funded by nonprofits and local business collaboratives. So that's some sort of context as to the background and why this direction is being emphasized nowadays. So yeah. So this is the research question. What types and kinds of services should a local community center for the disabled provide for clients to foster independence, healthy living, and integration within the local community? I hope that's not too broad of a question. So, what should the role of a center be? This was kind of the main focus and a key point. What should the role of a center in the 21st century be? One key piece of research that I stumbled upon was that current centers for independent living today follow an independent based assistant approach where the focus is on giving clients, going on a client per client basis, giving them one piece of help or individualized help, but not really kind of going beyond that. And because of that, it kind of leaves clients isolated, and because they just have maybe one piece of the puzzle or like one type of help, it really it's less effective. A new conceptual framework would suggest that interdependent-based assistance that emphasizes social capital. So having like centers for independent living, connecting with other local organizations, sort of not just like being like, not just helping with social mobility aids, not just helping with different types of one type of assistance or another, but also just kind of going above and beyond in terms of like strengthening ties within the community. Actually helps community integration for persons with disabilities more and increases the independence for the disabled more so than past traditional approaches. Interestingly enough, that also supports another point of research that was published in the American Journal of Community Psychology, that distal social supports, distal meaning like a social support that isn't quite as close to you. So for example, like your friends and family members would be more like a relational support, like someone who's there all the time. A distal social support might be an acquaintance you meet at church, or another form of a distal social support would be like your neighbor or perhaps a community social worker. These are more integral key indicators of successful integration into community life for those with psychiatric disabilities than more immediate social supports. So people who have more numbers of distal social supports, like a friend you met at a bus stop, or the person you get Chinese food maybe from once a month, if you like to order Chinese food, or the grocery bag clerk that you interact with, for example, or just these kinds of social supports are more successful indicators of successful integration into community life. And so both of these types of research support one another. And what this means is that this type of social capital and this interdependence is clearly is a key factor based on the research for the role of a disabled independent community center. Another key factor that I found in my research was health and wellness. Well, among the disabled, because they have many health issues, you would think that access to health care would be common and easy to facilitate and maintain. However, a local study within Cuyahoga County would show that to be untrue and actually the opposite. They actually found that the most frequent barrier to getting treatment or performing a therapy is finding a doctor who provides that treatment or therapy. That was discovered by the Cuyahoga County Board of Developmental Disabilities back in 2004. That at the time they discovered that when they would conduct research as to why a client wanted to go through therapy, they assumed that the reason was transportation or perhaps financial reasons, but they found that to be untrue. They actually found that the reason was because they couldn't find a doctor who provided that treatment or therapy, and so creating that network and finding that network turns out to be a huge issue for persons with disabilities and for their caretakers and families as well. Another interesting factoid that I found and appreciated because I'm Finnish. This research was conducted by a Finnish group. Proper implementation of physical therapy for someone with ID stands for intellectual disabilities and DD stands for developmental disabilities. So proper implementation of physical therapy for someone with either ID or DD is important. Research between Finland and Cleveland State University showed that athletes from the Special Olympics within Finland were unfit and physically weaker than athletes from INAS, or the International Association of Sport for Para-Athletes with Intellectual Disabilities, and that athletes from the separate organization, INAS, were at fitness levels of non-disabled athletes or just below them. So this sort of shows that if that physical exercise is important and that proper physical therapy is also important, and that when you do physical therapy properly, then you can have someone with an intellectual disability who is just as active and just as fit as someone who is non-disabled, but only if you have that physical therapy that is effective. And I feel really bad because I used to have such a good perspective of the Special Olympics, but who knows? This is a small data set. This was only done in Finland, so who knows? But I'm interested. I had never heard of the International Association of Sport for Para-Athletes, so I now kind of want to Google them and see if there are more groups and organizations, maybe worldwide. There was another piece of information that I also found really troubling and alarming. It's an alarming fact that most people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are more likely to be sexually abused as adolescents and more likely to get STDs if they're sexually active. There's a lot of stigmas and prejudice that surround sexual activity and choice around those with both intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. There's also a lack of proper sexual education teaching tools. People with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities often require teaching tools for special education, um, and uh, currently there are many sexual education teaching tools that are readily available to them. Um, a lot of the sexual education tools are more readily available to their non-disabled peers, so there is an access limit to that as well. The kind of third key factor that I found in my research kind of surrounded employment. Um, Another kind of healthy part of community life is employment and work and kind of finding your purpose, whatever that may be. Research within Cuyahoga County, again in Northeast Ohio, showed that collaboration with local organizations and employment service providers showed that creating social networks between nonprofits and local businesses increased the employability and networking capabilities of persons with disabilities, and it also increased their employment placements. So again, you have this sort of like social networking kind of social capital that is so important to the integration of persons with disabilities into not just the social environment of the community, but also the employment environment. And they found that integrating and collaborating different businesses and nonprofits really helped to get persons increased employment placements with persons with disabilities. So that was very interesting. Um, and then another key piece of research was that this was in a law journal. Was that there is it was about funding for those who require something called long-term services and supports, or LTSS. And what long-term services and supports are is if you have a disabled person who requires long-term medical care throughout their entire life. So, for example, someone with cerebral palsy who just requires long-term medical care for their entire life, and that could be they could be ambulatory or non-ambulatory. Or it could be someone who has a variety of chronic health issues. Um, for for example, someone who has epilepsy and sleep apnea um, and and a heart condition, um, who just happens to need long-term care for the rest of their life. The funding for those who require LTSS, they to either remain on Medicaid and hold a job with the average American salary, which at this point is 45K a year, or forego Medicaid and receive some sort of reimbursement from the government for LTSS medical expenses is non-existent. That means that the burden is that they either have to remain on Medicaid, and that means that they have to stay under the poverty line. The result is that it's a substantial barrier to persons with disabilities seeking employment and a way out of poverty. And that means that persons with disabilities who might want to work, who would love to work, are limited by the cost of their LTSS, how much their long-term services and supports would cost. So that was a very interesting article. I enjoyed reading it. And I was very partial to that because I do have a lot of, I definitely fall under that category of someone needing long-term services and supports. Um, so I did decide that there are some recommendations. I think that the center should focus on interdependent ties for clients. I think it's important to foster and strengthen community integration and independence. I can't emphasize that enough. The research really shows that when you foster these collaborative partnerships, especially the employment collaborative thing I found so fascinating, making sure that partnering with local businesses and local nonprofits, as well, but especially local businesses. Um, and in the research, it was more so on the employment service provider, and in this case, it would be on the center. But making the center sort of like a key focal point for being like, hey, there are disabled people here; they can work. Sure, they're a little different, but aren't we all? There ain't nothing wrong with that. and sort of yeah, I think there's this and that's the best way to get disabled people out there and employed is just collaborating and talking with others. I think it's always been that way. I think it's just human nature, and it's cool that the research reflects that. I think another huge issue again is networking. Um, I'm not surprised that it's hard to find care sometimes. I've run into that issue myself. Networking local clinics, physician networks, and hospitals to ensure that once a treatment gets prescribed to someone with disabilities, that the proper connection can be created so that the client doesn't get lost in the system. So let's say someone with a Down syndrome gets prescribed a treatment, like they're a caretaker or the person with Down syndrome themselves. They're looking for a provider and they can't quite automatically find someone that they need. That connection can be made because sometimes you have a doctor who, once they prescribe the treatment, is so busy during their day that they just don't have the time to be like, this is who you go and see. Um, it happens to all of us, and I think it's important to make sure that that networking happens because that is just sometimes something that we can forget in these really short health appointments that people have, and making sure that whoever that they see is also covered by their insurance as well. I think it's important to have that system in place. Um, Another key facility for the health of a community, like any community, is comprehensive health and wellness programs like community exercise, yoga, Pilates, or a gym, and or even just like community sports or something that they can do together, as well as accessible sex education. I think that's also very important. I think a 21st century disability community center should have accessible sex education. I think that's necessary for the 21st century disability community center is you would have accessible sex education that is LGBTQ IA friendly, that also deals with sex education for persons in wheelchairs, that deals with sex education for people who have different types of handicaps and mobility issues, sex education for people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, people who have sensory issues. There's a whole host of things out there, and keeping people with these types of issues safe is important so that they don't get harmed and they don't get abused and they don't get taken advantage of. I think that's very important, and I think it's an issue that most people don't want to talk about because there is that history of not wanting to talk about it. Um, Another key important recommendation I would make is collaborating. Again, there's the networking with local nonprofits and local businesses. It's essential for community integration and job placement for clients. I think education and advocacy should also be a primary role for the betterment of clients' lives and future of the disability community. Um, and while some people might think, oh, we don't need to do education and advocacy, I disagree. I think that's actually, if you do all of these things above, but you don't do education and advocacy, you're only doing half the work. So you need to do education and advocacy to make sure that your clients still have rights and to make sure that your clients understand their rights and that the community understands their rights. And when your clients see that you're advocating for them and communicating for them, then they really appreciate that the work that you do. And then you also continue to exist as an organization. So I also think education and advocacy is a very important part of what a 21st century disability center would look like that serves local clients. I think it's very, very important that you should educate and advocate on behalf of your disabled clients. Some other recommendations I would make would be send out surveys to current clients and local disabled networks and residents to see if there are any other hidden or unaddressed issues within the community. Research can only go so far, and it's always important to ask peers and the local community what they want and what they need. It's always better to ask. Research can only go so far, and always make sure that you gather input and you don't assume anything. Network with local disabled activists within the local community. Organizations like the ARC, which is amazing. Make sure the county board, which also does good work. Local centers for independent living. There's about 2 in Cleveland. I think there's one on the east and one on the west side. See what resources can be shared and or network. Sharing is caring. And if you share your resources, that's all the better. Um, Nobody gets anything by being a dragon and hoarding. That's, sharing is caring. And always get in touch with the local paper to cover the work you're doing for the local community, to garner publicity for whatever project you're doing to increase interest, and then create positive awareness within the community. That's always a good thing. And yeah, here are my resources. I think I pretty much used almost everything except one article. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, that's about 9. Okay. Yeah, that is my little project there. I'm sorry if that was if that. Oh no.